Hey, spooky crew. How is everybody doing today? I hope you're safe, I hope you're warm, and I hope you're ready for a story that's going to stay with you long after this video ends. Get comfortable, coffee, tea, late night snack, whatever your vibe is, because today's case is one that makes you stop and actually think. This is not a ghost story. This isn't something hiding in an abandoned building. This is something far scarier, because it happened inside a home that was supposed to be filled with love. Today we're diving into the case of the Watts family, a story that shocked the world and showed just how dangerous someone can be when they decide their wants matter more than human life. This case is about betrayal. It's about deception. And it's about how sometimes the real monsters don't live in the dark. They live behind a perfectly normal front door. And we're starting where every real story should begin. Before the headlines, before the interrogations, before the courtroom, there was a woman named Shanann Watts. Shanann was vibrant, driven, outspoken, and deeply devoted to the people she loved. She was the kind of person who gave everything she had to her family, her time, her energy, her heart. If something mattered to Shanann, she showed up for it. Fully. She was a mother who celebrated every milestone. First steps, first words, silly dances in the living room, bedtime routines. She didn't just love her children, she lived for them. To the outside world, Shanann may have seemed confident, bold, and even strong-willed. But to those closest to her, she was also protective, emotional, and fiercely loyal. She wanted her family to succeed. She wanted them to be happy. And she believed, with everything in her, that love and effort could fix anything. Her daughters were her world. Bella, 4 years old, was gentle, thoughtful, and observant. She had a quiet sweetness about her, a little girl who watched carefully, who loved deeply, who trusted completely. The kind of child who just wanted to make people proud. And then there was Celeste, Cece, 3 years old. Pure fire and joy, loud laughter, boundless energy, fearless personality. She was the kind of child who ran head first into life without hesitation, who filled every room with noise and light. 2 little girls so different in spirit, yet equally adored by their mother. And Shanann wasn't just a mum to 2. She was also 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy they planned to name Nico. She talked about his future. She imagined his first smile. She dreamed about the life her children would grow up together in. To Shanann, her family was everything. These weren't characters in a story. They weren't faces on a screen. They were a real woman, 2 real children, and a baby who never got the chance to be born. They had personalities, they had routines, they had futures, and they trusted the person who was supposed to protect them more than anyone else in the world. That trust would be the very thing that cost them their lives. From the outside, Chris Watts looked like the kind of man people trusted without question. He was quiet, soft-spoken, hard-working. The type of guy neighbors described as nice. The type of husband co-workers said kept to himself. The type of father who didn't raise his voice and didn't draw attention. He didn't stand out. And that's exactly what made him dangerous. Chris presented himself as dependable, the man who went to work every day, paid the bills, and smiled for family photos. He played the role of the calm, easygoing husband, while Shanann was the louder, more expressive one. To outsiders, Their dynamic looked like a strong woman married to a laid-back man. But beneath that quiet exterior was something deeply broken. Chris had difficulty expressing emotion. He avoided confrontation. He didn't communicate when he was unhappy. Instead of dealing with conflict, he swallowed it, until resentment began to build in silence. And resentment doesn't disappear, it festers. By 2018, Chris had started pulling away from his family emotionally. Friends noticed he seemed distant, less affectionate, less engaged. He stopped acting like a husband who was fighting for his marriage and started acting like a man who had already checked out. Then came the affair. Chris began a relationship with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he thought was freedom. He imagined a life without responsibility, without children, without a pregnant wife, without the identity of husband and father. Instead of seeing his family as the people who loved him, he began seeing them as obstacles. And that is where the shift happened. Most people, when they're unhappy in a marriage, make painful but responsible choices. Divorce, separation, therapy, honesty. Chris didn't want the mess. He didn't want the judgment. He didn't want child support, shared custody, or the reality of consequences. He wanted a clean slate, not a new chapter, a deleted story. What makes this even more disturbing is that nothing about his behavior suggested rage or loss of control. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a moment of emotional collapse. This was planned. He researched, he lied. He created a narrative where his family simply disappeared. Chris Watts did not snap. He decided. And the man who once tucked his daughters into bed became the person who chose to erase them from existence. On the night of August 12, 2018, Shanann Watts was returning home from a business trip to Arizona. She was exhausted, pregnant, emotionally drained from trying to hold together a marriage that was already slipping away. Friends later said she felt something was wrong. Chris had been distant, cold, unreachable. But Shanann was still trying, still believing that honesty, effort, and love could fix what was breaking. Her flight landed just before 2 a.m. A friend dropped her off at her home in Frederick, Colorado. That was the last time anyone outside that house would ever see Shanann alive. Inside those walls was the life she had built, and the man who had already decided it was in the way. According to Chris's confession, sometime after she came home, they talked about their relationship. Shanann wanted answers. She wanted to know where they stood. She wanted to understand why her husband felt like a stranger. But what she didn't know was that the decision had already been made. Chris later admitted that he had been thinking about what he was going to do before she ever walked through the door. This was not a sudden argument. This was not a moment of emotional loss of control. This was something he had already chosen. At some point that night, while Shanann was in their bedroom, tired, vulnerable, and carrying his unborn child, Chris took her life. A pregnant mother was taken in the very place she believed was safe. And then, the night became even more unthinkable. Chris wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet. He carried her down the stairs, and he placed her in the back of his truck. At that moment, his daughters were still alive. Little Bella, little Celeste, Cece. 2 children who trusted their father completely. Chris later said that the girls walked out to the truck, asking what was wrong with their mum. He said they were confused, quiet, afraid. And then he did something that defies all human understanding. He drove them nearly an hour to his worksite with their mother's body in the truck with them. Think about that. 2 little girls, in the dark, beside their mother, with the one person they believed would always protect them. When they arrived at the site, Chris ended the lives of his daughters one after the other. First Celeste, then Bella. And what makes this moment so haunting, so impossible to forget, is what Chris later admitted Bella said to him. She looked at her father and asked, "Daddy, is the same thing going to happen to me as Cece?" She understood. She was afraid. She knew something was terribly wrong. And he did it anyway. There are crimes, there are betrayals, and then there is this. He took the lives of the children who called him Dad. Afterward, he placed their bodies inside oil tanks. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave nearby along with the baby she was carrying. 4 lives, 1 family, disposed of like evidence. Then Chris went to work. He answered texts, he spoke to co-workers, he went about his day, as if nothing had happened. No visible panic, no breakdown, no signs of what had just taken place. Just normal. And that is what makes this chapter so disturbing. This was not chaos. This was not emotional loss of control. This was deliberate, planned, cold. The home that once held birthday parties, bedtime stories, and family photos became the starting point of one of the most heartbreaking cases in modern true crime. A woman who loved her family with everything she had, and 3 children who trusted their father with their lives, were taken in a single night. Not by a stranger, not by someone hiding in the dark, but by the man who promised to protect them. When the sun came up on August 13th, 2018, Chris Watts was living in a world he believed he could control. Shanann was gone. The girls were gone. And in his mind, so was the problem. But what he didn't account for was one thing. Shanann was loved. She was connected, and people noticed when she disappeared. That morning, Shanann missed a doctor's appointment, something that never happened. She wasn't answering calls. She wasn't texting. Her phone was silent. And the person who knew something was wrong immediately was her best friend. Within hours, police were called to the Watts home in Frederick, Colorado for a welfare check. When officers arrived, Chris was already there. He let them inside calmly. He spoke politely. He acted concerned, but nothing about the scene made sense. Shanann's purse was still inside. Her phone was still there. Her car was still in the garage. The house was clean. Too clean. It didn't look like someone had packed up and left. It looked like someone had vanished. Chris told police that his wife had taken the girls to a friend's house after an argument, but he couldn't explain where they were. He didn't know who they were with. He didn't know why she hadn't taken her phone or her car, and that's when the cracks started to show. Later that day, Chris stood in front of television cameras. He asked for his family to come home. He said he just wanted them safe. But something about him felt off. His words didn't match his expression. There was no urgency, no panic, no visible fear. Viewers would later say the same thing. He didn't look like a husband searching for his family. He looked like a man trying to sell a story. Investigators weren't convinced either. They reviewed security footage from a neighbor's camera. It showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning, something he never did. The footage showed movement, loading, and a timeline that didn't fit the story he was telling. At the same time, Shanann's phone was discovered inside the house, hidden between couch cushions. Her wedding ring was found. To police, that wasn't evidence of a woman who left voluntarily. That was evidence of someone who never had the chance. Within 2 days, Chris agreed to take a polygraph test. And this is where everything changed. The examiner told him that the results showed deception. Chris didn't argue. He didn't deny it. Instead, he broke. But not in the way an innocent person would. At first, he offered a new story. He claimed that Shanann had harmed the girls, and that in a moment of emotion, he had reacted. But that story didn't hold. The evidence didn't match. The timeline didn't fit. And his words sounded rehearsed. Investigators pressed him. And eventually, the truth began to surface. Chris admitted that Shanann was gone because of him. That the girls were gone because of him. That he had taken their lives and hidden their bodies. The man who had begged on camera for his family's return had known the entire time where they were. And that realization hit the world like a punch to the chest. This wasn't a missing persons case. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was a family destroyed from the inside. Police immediately launched a search at his worksite, and what they found confirmed every fear. The place where he had gone to work that morning was the place where he had taken his family. The story was no longer about whether something had happened. It was about how someone could do something so devastating and then stand in front of cameras, neighbors, and law enforcement, pretending to be the worried husband. From that moment on, the narrative shifted. Chris Watts was no longer the man looking for his family. He was the man who had erased them. And the world was about to learn just how calculated that erasure had been. Once Chris Watts admitted what he had done, there was no unringing that bell. The man who had stood on his front porch asking for his family to come home was now sitting across from investigators, finally telling the truth. But even then, the truth didn't come all at once. At first, Chris tried to soften it. He tried to rewrite it. He tried to make himself look less responsible for what had happened. He spoke in fragments. He avoided details. He shifted blame. But the evidence didn't bend to his version of events. Bit by bit, the story came out. Not because he suddenly found a conscience, but because there was nowhere left to hide. Investigators confronted him with what they had found at his worksite. They asked direct questions. They refused to let him retreat into half-truths. And slowly, the full reality surfaced. Chris admitted that his wife was gone because of him. That his daughters were gone because of him. That the future they were supposed to have had ended at his hands. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about accountability. What shocked so many people wasn't just what he confessed to, it was how he did it. There were no tears, no visible collapse, no emotional unraveling. His voice stayed even, his posture stayed calm, his words sounded rehearsed. For many watching later, that was almost harder to process than the crime itself, because it raised a terrifying question. How does someone do something so devastating and speak about it like it was just another event in their day? As the interrogation recordings became public, people around the world listened in silence. Parents, partners, families, all trying to understand how a husband could destroy the very people who trusted him most. But the truth was unavoidable. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of losing control. This was a decision. And once the confession was complete, the case moved quickly. There was no drawn-out trial, no courtroom battle over innocence. Chris Watts pleaded guilty to every charge brought against him. He did not stand before a jury to argue. He did not claim misunderstanding. He did not deny what he had done. Instead, he admitted it. And in doing so, he forced the world to confront something unbearable, that this wasn't a mystery anymore. This was a family annihilated by someone who had once promised to love and protect them. When news broke that he had confessed, the reaction was immediate. Shock, anger, disbelief. People who had followed the case from the beginning felt betrayed by the man who had looked into cameras and begged for his family's return. Comment sections filled with one question over and over again. How could he? And the truth is, there is no answer that will ever make sense. No motive that balances the scale. No explanation that justifies what happened. There is only the reality of what was lost. A mother who loved fiercely, 2 little girls who trusted completely, and a baby who never got the chance to be born. As the legal process moved forward, one thing became clear. This case would never be about him. It would be about Shanann, about Bella, about Celeste, about Nico, about 4 lives that mattered, and a reminder, one that still echoes today, that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers, dark alleys, or hidden threats. Sometimes it comes from the person standing beside you. Once Chris Watts confessed, the case moved quickly, but the emotional weight of it only grew heavier. This was no longer a mystery. It was no longer a question of what happened. Now it was about accountability. In November of 2018, Chris Watts stood in a Colorado courtroom and formally pleaded guilty to every charge against him. There would be no trial, no drawn-out legal battle, no attempt to claim innocence. He admitted responsibility for the deaths of his wife, his daughters, and the unborn child Shanann was carrying. And with that admission, the focus shifted where it always should have been. To the victims. To the family members who had lost everything. To the people who now had to sit in a courtroom and listen to what had been done to the ones they loved most. During the sentencing hearing, the room was filled with grief that no words could ever fully capture. Shanann's family stood face to face with the man who had taken their daughter, their granddaughters, and their grandson before he was ever born. Her mother, her father, her brother. They didn't speak in anger alone. They spoke in heartbreak. Shanann's father described what it meant to lose his daughter, his firstborn, along with her children and her unborn baby. He spoke about birthdays that would never come, holidays that would never feel whole again, and the silence left behind in a family that once overflowed with love and laughter. And then something happened that no one expected. Shanann's mother spoke directly to Chris and offered forgiveness. Not because what he did was forgivable, not because justice wasn't deserved, but because she refused to let hatred be the final thing left behind. In a moment that stunned the courtroom, she said she hoped God would forgive him. For many watching, that moment was almost impossible to comprehend. How do you forgive someone who took everything from you? And yet, she did. Not for him, for herself, for her family, for the chance to keep living in a world that still held some kind of meaning. Chris also spoke. His words were quiet, measured, carefully chosen. He said he was sorry. He said he loved his family. He said he would carry what he had done for the rest of his life. But for many, the words felt empty, because some actions are too final for apologies. The judge then delivered the sentence. Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the loss of the unborn child, and further time for what he did after the fact. In simple terms, he will never walk free again. No appeals, no chance at release, no second life waiting for him. A man who once dreamed of a fresh start would now spend the rest of his days behind walls and bars. And while no sentence could ever bring back Shanann, Bella, Celeste, or Nico, this was the closest thing to justice the legal system could offer. But even with the case officially closed, the story did not end. For Shanann's family, the loss was permanent. Their home would never sound the same. Their holidays would never feel the same. Their future would always be marked by the absence of 4 souls who should still be here. And for the world watching, the case became something more than a crime story. It became a warning that danger does not always look like a villain, that evil does not always announce itself, that sometimes the person who causes the most harm is the one people least expect. The Watts case forced millions to confront a terrifying truth. You can share a life with someone, build a family with someone, trust someone completely, and still never truly know what they are capable of. But through the horror, one thing has never been forgotten. This is not the story of a man. This is the story of Shanann, a mother who loved fiercely; Bella, a gentle little girl with a trusting heart; Celeste, a bright, fearless soul full of joy; and Nico, a life that never got the chance to begin. They were real, they were loved, and they mattered. And no sentence, no matter how long, will ever change that. Even after the courtroom fell silent, even after the sentence was handed down, even after the world stopped asking what happened, this case never truly ended. Because some stories don't close. They stay with us. They follow us into quiet moments. They resurface when we least expect them. The Watts case is one of those stories. Not because of the man who committed the crime, but because of the lives that were taken. Shanann, a woman who loved loudly, who fought for her family, who believed in fixing what was broken instead of walking away. Bella, gentle, thoughtful, a child who trusted deeply in the people she loved. Celeste, Cece, bright, fearless, full of energy and laughter that should still be echoing through a home. And Nico, a baby who never got to take his first breath, never got to be held, never got the chance to exist outside his mother's hopes and dreams. 4 lives that were not headlines. That sometimes the greatest danger does not come from outside our lives, but from within them. This case shattered the illusion that it could never happen here, that love alone is always enough, that the people closest to us are always who they seem to be. But it also revealed something else. The strength of a family who refused to let their loved ones be reduced to a criminal narrative. Shanann's parents, her brother, the people who stood up and made sure the world knew who she really was. Not just a victim, but a daughter, a sister, a mother. They chose to speak her name, to speak her children's names, to remind everyone that this was not about a man's actions, but about 4 lives that mattered. And that is what endures. Not the crime, not the court documents, not the interrogation footage. What endures is the memory of who Shanann was before the world knew her name, who Bella and Cece were before they became part of a headline, who Nico was supposed to be. This case is painful. It is unsettling. It leaves us with questions that will never have answers. But it also leaves us with responsibility. To remember them. To speak their names. To recognize the signs of emotional distance, isolation, and control when we see them. To take nothing for granted in the relationships we hold closest. Because behind every true crime story, there were once ordinary days, family photos, laughter, plans for the future. And when those things are gone, all that remains is the truth that these lives were real. And they deserved so much more than what they were given. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, Nico. They were here. They were loved. And they will never be forgotten. Before I end this, I want to pause for a moment. Not for the case, not for the headlines, not for the man who did this, but for the people who were lost. Because when the cameras shut off and the story fades from the news cycle, they are still gone. And they deserve more than to be remembered only for how their lives ended. So right now, I'm reflecting on Shanann, on Bella, on Celeste, and on Nico. On a mother who loved with her whole heart, on two little girls who trusted the world around them, and on a baby who never got the chance to take his first breath. What happened to them was shocking. It was devastating. And it was something they did not deserve ever. There is no explanation that makes it okay, no reason that makes it understandable, only a loss that will always be felt by the people who loved them. So today, and always, I say their names with respect. Rest in peace, Shanann. Rest in peace, Bella. Rest in peace, Celeste. Rest in peace, Nico. You mattered. You were loved. And you will never be forgotten. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like this video in their memory. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told with honesty and respect, share this so their names continue to be spoken. If you're new here and you walk with me through true crime, the unexplained, and the stories that deserve a voice, make sure you follow and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Take care of yourselves out there. Stay aware. Stay kind to the people you love. And as always, stay safe. Stay spooky. Bye, guys.